Another area that I know I have questions about, and a lot of people that I know have questions about, is GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, sometimes called GE. And from my understanding is that forever humans have been genetically engineering crops to be more healthy, and we've selected and we've hybridized and we've done all those things. But there's a difference between that and GMOs. So
Yeah.
could you just speak in, this is a big, big question.
Right.
Could you speak to explaining like what it really is and your take on it?
Okay. So it is true that for 5,000 years now, humans have been selecting crops.
Right.
But so this was done more of a process of either, well, originally it was done by just selecting this crop has performed incredibly well, so I'm going to save this seed as opposed to this seed.
Right.
And then over time it evolved into, okay, this crop has this attribute that I like, this crop has this attribute that I like, I'm going to plant them side by side, let them cross-pollinate, and then I'm going to collect the seed from the two, sow those out, and select from that the attributes that I want to plant. So it's a natural selection process. We're letting plants naturally hybridize, and then we're selecting the best out of that, and then continuing in that
So
project.
is that would be the old school?
Yeah, so that's the old school.
Yeah. So what's different now?
And so I think it's important that like genetic engineering, genetic modification, it's got a federal definition, right? It's not conventional breeding. I mean, that's, everything that was done prior to 1980, that is not genetic engineering. So genetic modification or genetic engineering is the use of either gene splicing, gene multiplication, gene insertion. There's a lot of different techniques for introducing genes into a genetic code, but it is selecting a gene from one organism, taking it out, and inserting it into another organism.
So it's really, this has to happen in a laboratory. This is not something a farmer
This isn't done
can
in
do.
a field. Yeah.
Okay.
And so
That's a really helpful clarification.
yeah, and it's interesting. Well, I have a complicated view on genetic engineering personally because I don't think that science is the boogeyman. So I'm okay with appropriate technologies. I think the interesting thing, the biggest hole for me in genetic engineering is that there's a lot of really good potential technology that could come from genetic engineering. The golden rice, that was a great approach at genetic engineering of rice that was vitamin fortified. So if that had worked out, that could have potentially solved a lot of problems for a lot of third world countries. The apple that doesn't brown. Okay, that's interesting. I don't think it probably isn't necessarily dangerous. Probably not a world-changing technology, but what bothers me about genetic engineering is it kind of goes back to that pesticide conversation we had earlier. Is most of these technologies, they're either for a herbicide resistance, or they're incorporating some type of bacterium or fungi into a crop that is then producing a insecticide within the plant. And so the problem with that goes back to that managing pesticide resistance. When you have like BT corn, which is that Bacillus thuringiensis corn, a gene was selected out of the fungi that kills an insect class, inserted into corn, and then the corn produces Bacillus thuringiensis within inside the body. So anything that feeds on that is going to get a dose of BT.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when we have that constant selection pressure of BT is always applied, then we encourage a pest population to adapt, because the only things that survive are the ones that can tolerate BT.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with Roundup resistant cotton or Roundup resistant corn. We're always applying glyphosate,
Mm-hmm.
and so we quickly, it was 5 years and we had Roundup resistant Palmer amaranth.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting, the application of technology isn't very intelligent.
Mm.
It's some incredibly advanced scientific techniques. They just aren't being applied into an agriculturally intelligent application.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that's...
Right, and then is it true that a genetically engineered seed, or some of them, cannot be resown? Like, let's say let's say you had I'm going to say tomato.
Mm-hmm.
You might not be picking the right plant, or a corn or whatever, and you take a seed from that plant, and because that was how farmers could sustain their
Mm-hmm.
farms for many years.
Yeah.
Is that true?
So there are terminator genes in some GMO crops. It's interesting. It was really originally the terminator genes were introduced as kind of an environmental protection thing.
Because we didn't know what was going to
Yeah,
happen.
because they were trying to get regulatory approval. The biggest crop out there that nobody knows about and that's genetically engineered is pine trees.
Pine trees.
Yeah, there's tons of genetically engineered pine trees, and so it was originally to get regulatory approval. They had to manage the pollen from these pine trees and prevent spread into the ecosystem.
And is this to harvest lumber?
Right, for lumber, fast-growing lumber.
I didn't know that. It's
Yeah.
fascinating.
And so, the terminator gene kind of morphed out of like a regulatory compliance thing into a, kind of a protection of the crop.
And is
patent.
it ultimately financial?
Yeah, ultimately now it's probably more financial.
From regulation of saying we can control this,
Mhm.
and that might have been because maybe
Yeah.
we didn't know what it was going to do,
Yeah.
and now it's also the financial side.
Yeah.
So there is not. It says until like every crop is that way,
Yeah,
but some
like-
are, some aren't.
Roundup Ready corn is not. It doesn't have a terminator gene, so.
Okay, you can grow it as many times as you want. Yeah.
Well, it's still patented, so a farmer, it would be illegal to harvest corn from your Roundup Ready, or
Right.
harvest seed from your Roundup Ready corn and replant it.
And so this leads to other questions.
Yeah.
Everyone kind of reels on Monsanto and this and Roundup and this whole thing. So I think I saw a video of a farmer who they weren't even planning that, but it had come from somebody else's farm.
Yeah.
I don't know how.
It's interesting.
And there's a controversy there, like they got sued. So
Right. So the problem is a lot of those really early lawsuits were the first one, the big one, was actually a farmer who had planted out his seed crop next door to a Roundup Ready field,
Mhm.
and then harvested corn off of that, and then planted out his fields, and then immediately started spraying glyphosate on his fields. It's like, well, he obviously wasn't trying to avoid the Roundup Ready gene
Mhm.
because he started spraying glyphosate
Mhm.
on it. So that was really that was the one that kind of cut the legs out of this genetic drift problem
Okay.
that we have now. But yeah, now you can certainly have genetic drift of any wind pollinated crop. So
Mhm.
any of the grains are the big ones. But you can have those into conventional non-GE fields or into organic fields. With organic, there has to be, it's part of that whole organic system plan. A farmer has to know what are the genetic drift
And who's the neighbor.
possibilities around. and what are you doing to prevent it from being
Right.
incorporated into your plan? So a lot of organic farmers use temporal buffers if they, because
What is that?
so well, I guess we should first talk about like a regular distance buffer.
Oh, okay.
So a space buffer would be, I'm backing off this far from my neighboring conventional farm.
Certain number of feet or meters
Yeah,
or whatever.
and it becomes problematic with crops like corn because the pollen can be spread 2 miles. And so how do you get, if you're in the farm belt, the corn belt, how do you get 2 miles away from anybody that's growing genetically engineered corn when 95% of the corn is genetically engineered? And so they start using things like temporal buffers, which is a buffer in time.
Oh,
So, so you find out, okay, when are your neighbors planning to plant? When is their corn going to be dehiscing pollen or releasing pollen? And so you either go before them so that your corn is receptive to pollen before that's pollen's released, or after after they're
Fascinating.
pollinated.
Most of us who are eating regular vegetables are not thinking about any of this amazing stuff that's happening behind the scenes. You've answered a lot of my questions about the GMO. And I think just it might be helpful just to reiterate for people who are watching that the organic certification already means no GMO.
Right.
It's included. And there's also the non-GMO project label. So that would be a farm that has not got an organic certification, but they are saying, hey, we're using this. So some of the people and scientists I listen to and that I follow say we just don't know enough yet about GMOs. Like you kind of mentioned with the DDT earlier. When DDT came out, it was like, well, this is great. And then it was later that the health risk and the environmental risk came into play. So sounds like something to keep watching, keep studying.
Right, and it's
be mindful.
and it's a complicated thing, and there's certainly potential for one crop, one genetically engineered crop to be deleterious and another to not.
Exactly. Right.
And that's kind of the nature with any breeding, whether it's conventional or genetically engineered.